Hello, welcome back to our bookshop in Tring. I'm Ben Morehouse. Many of you have been aware that we're doing a book club now in our bookshop, and it started in May. Our first book was Saving Missy by Beth Murray. We did an interview with her, and those that bought the book then joined us for a collective Zoom and gave her book a unanimous 10 out of 10. So such a good choice for our first one. Our second book, our June book, is When We Fall. I say was our book When We Fall by Carolyn Kirby, and we're going to be doing the collective Zoom. Everyone who's bought that joining us on Monday evening, and actually Carolyn's going to join us as well. Our July book of the month is Claire Mackintosh and After the End. Without further ado, we're going to have an interview with her. She's going to be interviewed by a good friend of ours and local resident, Rowan Coleman, who writes under the name of Bella Ellis. Anyway, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Rowan and Claire.
Thank you, Ben. And hi to Claire Mackintosh, who I'm delighted to be Zooming with today in a lovely literary interview on behalf of our bookshop Tring. Claire, hello.
Hello, this is so exciting. I was trying to work out when we've actually spoken face to face, and I can't really pin it down. It's you're one of those people we meet very occasionally at book events, but actually I don't think we've ever sat down and talked books, so this is a real joy.
That is absolutely right. We've seen each other at festivals, at events, and actually the first time I met you was at a Chipping Norton Literary Festival, I think in 2014 or 15.
Yes, so we did an event together, didn't we? Of course we did, with Hannah Beckerman, talking about motherhood in literature, which I thought actually, I'll go back to that in a minute, but I think that really kind of preempted your beautiful book, which I have here, After the End. And I'll remind you of something you said to me back then in a little bit, but first of all, let us talk about you and how you came to write this book. So you were working around books with the festival. You founded the festival, which was amazingly successful. And then your first novel, I Let You Go, was hugely successful, taut, exciting, twisty thriller. Followed up with two more thrillers, which is I See You, and for some reason I haven't written down the title of the other one. Let Me Lie.
Let Me Lie. Excellent. You've passed. But After the End is so different. I mean, it's a complete shift in gear. And I'm not going to actually ask you why you decided to move out of genre, because as an author myself, I love writers who write in different genres. There's no law to say that you can only write one kind of book. But you've been very open about the fact that After the End is based on your own experiences of loss. And I'm wondering, first of all, I think, it must have taken you great courage and resolve to explore that experience through fiction. And I just wondered how you decided that now was the right time to do that.
I didn't really. So After the End was the very first book that I wanted to write. So it's a story that I've had in my head for a very long time. My son was critically ill in 2006, and I spent a long time in hospital, and we were faced with this horrific decision about whether we should keep fighting to enable our son to live a short life, but nevertheless to live with severe disabilities, or whether to remove him from intensive care and let him pass away. And so this story came from a conversation that I had at that point with a doctor, where I said, what happens if my husband and I don't agree? Because actually I'd seen lots of cases in the news where parents disagreed with hospitals, and those tragic cases ended up in court. But it suddenly occurred to me that my husband and I disagreed on all sorts of things, and what if we didn't agree on this? And she said, you have to agree, because the alternative is unthinkable. And so what I wanted to write with After the End was the unthinkable, because I think when you have a child, something rather extraordinary happens to the dynamics in your relationship, which is that up until that point, your partner is the most important person in your world, and you would do anything for them. You would lay down your life for them. And then you have a child, and you don't generally love your partner any less, but you love your child more. And so that it's such an interesting sort of occurrence. So I wanted to write this story, but I wasn't a writer anyway. I was a police officer, and so it was just a story that kind of nagged me. And then I became a writer. I Let You Go, as you say, really took off. And then I knew that I had to write another psychological thriller, because that is the way commercial fiction works. You write something and readers want more of the same. So when I sold my first novel, I Let You Go, I had a conversation with my editor right at the beginning, when she was still deciding whether or not she wanted me as one of her authors. And she said, "Are you writing anything else?" And I told her about After the End. But I followed it up very quickly by saying, "But I know that's not a thriller. I know you don't want that. That's fine. I'm just telling you." And it wasn't until 4 years later, when we were talking about what I should write as my fourth novel, and I was giving her some thriller ideas, and she said, "I just can't get that story out of my head that you told me all those years ago. I think you should write that, and I think your readers will come with you." And I was nervous about it, but I wanted to write it. And you mentioned genre change. I firmly resist the idea that it's hugely different. I think I hear quite a lot online and in kind of modern parlance about gender being a social construct, and I feel that genre is also a social construct and very much a publishing construct. So maybe we could talk a little bit about genre at this point.
Yes, I agree with you as well. One of the questions I wanted to ask you actually is, I think as a woman writing, do you find it a different experience in how people react to your writing between writing a thriller, which I think, and I'm not a thriller writer, but I think a woman writing a thriller has a certain amount of more respect paid to her work than a woman writing about women and writing an emotional story. And certainly in my experience, if you're a woman writing about women and writing about domestic life, emotional life, motherhood, you're kind of treated a little bit differently, for example, than male writers who write about domestic life, parenthood, romance, etc. Not naming any names, but I think we can all kind of conjure up a few. So do you find a difference in those two areas, or how have you kind of tackled that as a writer? You've just basically, have you just said to yourself, this is my story, I am telling it as me, Claire Mackintosh, it doesn't matter where publishers categorize it?
Yes, pretty much, because I firmly believe that a good story is a good story, whatever shelf it sits on. I know that genre is useful for retailers, that it is useful for publishers to signpost where a book might sit and how it might be positioned. But those are all marketing elements, that they're not actually what a reader thinks. And yet, of course, there are some readers who are real die-hard crime fans or sci-fi fans, and they won't ever look at anything else. But actually, most people will have an open mind to a good story. But I've really noticed the difference in publishing my first three, which I'm very comfortable putting in a thriller category, psychological thriller, suspense. I'm not really that bothered how they're categorized, but they skirt around the edges of the crime world. And there's no doubt about it, the crime world is deeply respected. There are outlets for it. There are crime festivals. There are crime literature review slots in newspapers. There are homes to go to. There are specific crime bloggers. It's quite extraordinary. And actually what I found when After the End came out is that I felt slightly adrift, because I couldn't attach myself onto a particular world. And when you start trying to look for a world to attach yourself to, you're left with the rather problematic women's fiction. And actually, this morning I looked on Amazon, which I rarely do, but I needed to find an ISBN. And I looked on Amazon and noticed that After the End had a bestseller flag, 3 bestseller flags, little orange flags. So I thought, oh, that's exciting. I'll go and see what it's a bestseller in. And of course, this is entirely down to categories that my publisher has put this book into, and obviously readers that are choosing from those categories. So currently, After the End is a top seller in medical fiction, which, you know, I'll take, although it's a bit of a weird category, I think, to go looking for books in. Women's fiction, and something else that escapes me. So I went into women's fiction and I looked at all the covers, and they are all very sort of happy and appealing to a feminine brain, I suppose. It's quite bizarre. And then I looked for an equivalent category for men, and you will know this already, that there is no men's fiction category. And so I'm just sort of back at this rather sort of, I'm tired of the whole women's fiction thing, because it shouldn't exist, should it?
100% agree with you. And other people say to me, so what's it like being a women's fiction writer? I say, I'm a fiction writer who is a woman. And no less important are women as characters, and their issues, their experience of life are no less important than the male experience, or the male gaze of life. So I think there is a lot of work to do in publishing, in how we market and portray books, because a lot of those books you're talking about with the lovely covers and buntings, and there's often a cafe, they are books that cover real important serious.
Oh my word, they are. One of my favorite women's fiction authors, and I'm using, for anyone listening to this and not watching it, I'm using massive air quotes to make the point that this is not my own category. But one of my favorite authors in that field is Jenny Colgan, and her Island series is so incredibly nuanced. There are incredible characters on there. There's a doctor who is I think he's Syrian refugee who has built up his practice there, and there's a huge subplot all the way through a couple of those books about him being reunited with his children. They deal with loneliness, with relationships. That they're absolutely incredible books, and yet I think, and I'm not a marketer, but I think they are packaged in a very light and slightly frothy way that completely belies the quality and the depth of what's inside them.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, and I'd like to give a shout out to Millie Johnson and Carol Matthews as well, who write really great, emotional, important books with beautiful covers, but that probably don't reflect the content. And I wonder if that's because obviously readers know what are inside those books, because they read them again and again and again, and they're not looking for something else. But publishers and bookshops and marketeers still want the fluffy covers on the front. So maybe it's like a sort of vicious cycle.
It is. It's self-perpetuating, I think. And you know, and I guess that, you know, the cover issue is slightly different to the genre category issue, perhaps. But I have found it interesting to move from crime fiction that has a clear identity to a book that doesn't have an identity. It doesn't, because actually it's that the technical classification is general fiction, which I guess an awful lot of people's books slip into. And so I've had those questions, you know, what type of book is it? And I say it's general fiction, and they say, what does that mean? And I say, it's a book.
Yeah.
It's a novel.
About
This
the
is what
human
it's about.
condition. Yeah.
You know, read it, don't read
Yeah.
it, like
Yeah.
it, don't like it. It's a
I
book.
agree. Yeah. And I think that's so important as well, that you, and I'm grateful to you to sort of joining in, standing up for the general fiction cry for all women authors everywhere. The other thing about this novel which makes it really an interesting and compelling read is the way that you decided to structure it in at this sort of which path juncture. You get to the point where you have to decide which direction you're going to go in, and for the purposes of this novel, you make both decisions. I don't think that's a spoiler, is it? Anyway,
Massive spoiler. No. I mean, it is a spoiler, but it's one that I talk about all the time. Well, this was always the point of this novel. So back then in 2006, 2007, when I was reeling from what had happened to us, and I was starting to think about this story, I thought, well, what I want to do is I want to look at decision making, because we, like many parents, had this awful life or death decision to make, but actually everybody has these critical decisions, and some people make lots of them and some people only make a few, but they can be as mundane as whether you go out, you know, whether you cross the road or not, or as critical as whether you leave a marriage, or whether you move towns, or, you know, make a best friend. All these things are the sliding door moments that have the potential to send our life off in a different direction. And it came from a conversation with my father in the immediate aftermath of this, of being presented with this decision. And my father was a doctor, and it must have been horrific to have this conversation with me about his grandson. But he was very wise, and he talked about needing to mentally walk down the two different roads to see what that would look like in 5 years' time. And he said, you need to do that not to know what your life will be like, but what his life will be like, you know, because this isn't a decision you're making for you, this is a decision you're making for him. And it made me think of the poem by Frost, The Road Not Taken, which is a really, really incredible poem. And in it, Frost talks about standing in a yellow wood and looking down two paths, and he says, would that I was one traveller and could travel both. He says it much better than that. And we want to do that. And when I was a child, I used to read those choose your own adventure books, and I loved them. And I used to read them with my fingers holding the position of all the different outcomes, because I couldn't bear the thought of ending, you know, of having made the wrong decision. So I'd want to go back and choose a different path. And that's what I wanted to write, not a choose your own adventure book, but just that very simple, do I turn left? Do I turn right? And for Max and Pip, that way, that choice is very stark. Do I keep my son alive or do I not? And what does that choice look like? And so I wrote the book with a split narrative. So from halfway through, at the moment where you're waiting to find out what the judge has decided, because this is a crisis that has to go to court, we then follow two different outcomes. And so in that respect, it's a slightly speculative novel. But what it does, I think, is it enables you to explore not just people's decision making, but the consequences of it. Because I firmly believe that actually it's never the decision itself that's important. It's always the way we deal with it. And so we can leave that marriage, or we can stay in it, or we can take the job, or we can turn it down. But you have to commit to it, and you have to make that path the right one for you. And that's how you find peace with your actions, and that's how you find happiness again.
Yeah, that is really good advice, actually. That's really good life advice. I'm just going to take that on board. I needed to hear that today. I think that this book is incredibly beautiful. It's very emotional. Made me cry a lot. But it also is really warm. It's very life affirming, and it's full of hope. And I think it's, as an author that has written about mortality and death, it's really difficult. I think one of the things that I struggle with the most is to try and be authentic without being too dark, to be emotional without being too mawkish, to put hope into the darkest scenarios. And I think you have done that really brilliantly well. Is that a journey that is that a conscious sort of, did you make conscious choices, or was that more of an instinctive writing process for you?
A little bit of both. I, by nature, I like humour. I like to find the lightness. I'm essentially fairly Pollyanna-ish in my outlook, and so I will always look for the light in the darkness. It's possibly a little bit of a hangover from being in the police as well, where you sort of needed to search out the lightness in order to cope with the difficult things that you were doing. There was a very deliberate element to the novel as well, which was to introduce Layla, who is the Iranian doctor who cares for Pip and Max's son. And she was never supposed to be in the novel, but actually it would have been far too intense with just Pip and Max narrating the story. So she was introduced partly as a narrative device, in that as you'll know very well, when you're writing in first person, it's great for getting inside someone's head, but it's restrictive in terms of what you can tell the reader, because of course if that character isn't in the room, then you can't explain what's happening. So Layla was able to give an objective viewpoint on things, and to give an angle on characters that was a bit different. But she also introduced much needed levity, and so she has her own narrative arc with her mother, and that they love to cook, they make Persian food, and there's a lightness to her chapters that gives us that contrast. But I think if I had tried to write this book back in 2006, 2007, when I first had the idea, it would have failed. And it would have failed partly because I think I've learned so much about writing and constructing a novel and constructing characters over the last 5 years, that I have done a much better job at it, like anyone sort of honing their craft. But also because I was in a much darker place then than I am now. And the title of the novel suggests that this is not about just the darkness. It's not just about that terrible tragedy. It is about what happens afterwards. And so I needed to live that afterwards. For me, it's been 13 years, and I know that life goes on. I know that you meet people that make you happy. You can maintain a relationship. You can have more children. That there are lots of things that enrich my life now that I couldn't see back then, because back then life was very dark and there wasn't a great deal to look forward to. And so I think it's a very personal book, although it's certainly not my story. But that lightness and that feeling of hope came because I had seen that hope for myself.
And I think that is one of the wonderful things about the book, actually, is that you are somebody who has found hope, who has found joy, and lived your best future after something that is truly terrible and tragic. And that is a great gift to give to readers, that if they're going through something similar or any dark times in their life, that there is that hope, there is a future that where the shadow won't be there anymore. And that's one of the things I think that makes it a really wonderful book. So we've got time for one more question, I think, which I want to ask you, the archetypal question at the end of all of these interviews. I'm sure you know what I'm going to ask you. It's not the where do you get your ideas from. It's you have really achieved so much in your career. So what's your top tip to any budding writers out there? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, well, do you know what it is? I'm trying to think about whether I'm answering that as for emerging writers or writers who are already published, because my advice is slightly different. Maybe I'll answer both. So my tip for emerging writers, by which I mean people who aren't yet published but are really serious about their writing. And so my tip for them is to tell people about their writing. And the reason I say that is because there's a tendency, I think, to be rather shy and secretive about writing as a hobby. And it's something that I find really confusing, because we don't do this about any other hobby. So I know lots of people who paint or who knit, and they are not secretive about the fact that they're knitting, perhaps because people don't turn around and say, oh, are you selling your scarves anywhere? Will I have seen your jumpers in Marks and Spencer? And so we keep our writing to ourselves. But if you don't tell people, then you will never have the incredible serendipitous introductions to people who can be helpful and useful to you. And this has happened numerous times in my life. And when I think back through the different connections that have made exciting things happen, they've only happened because I've been happy to talk to people. So, tell people you're writing a book. They won't laugh. They won't, they'll think you're amazing, because it is an amazing thing to be writing a book. So that's my big tip for people who are wanting to be published. But I do want to kind of share some, I don't know, not wisdom, but some thoughts for people who are already published, because I feel quite passionately about this. And it is that I think that we should all be viewing what we do as a business and be viewing ourselves as the CEO of that business. And I feel that many authors don't feel that they feel they write the book, they produce the product, and beyond that, everything is out of their control. They are grateful to be published. And yes, of course, we can be grateful for the wonderful job that we have and for the opportunity we have to do something we love for a living. But that gratitude shouldn't affect the sort of the balance of power. And so I'm very passionate about authors feeling empowered and in control of their businesses. I'd urge people to just have a little bit of a sense check if you are a published author, and make sure that you know who's calling the shots, because it's you.
That is really excellent advice, Claire. That's two great pieces of advice for today from one Zoom call. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming on to do this lovely talk with me for our bookshop in Tring. And your wonderful book, After the End, is going to be Book of the Month in the bookshop for the whole of July. So you can go get signed copies.
Very, very exciting. Thank you so much. Thank you for a lovely interview, which went far too fast. And I'm really excited that our bookshop have chosen After the End. It's lovely.
Marvellous. Thank you, Claire. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Massive thanks to Claire and to Rowan for that lovely interview. So After the End is available in our bookshop. Give us a call and we can add you to our mailing list as well. And so you can be invited to the book club Zoom. With every book, you also get a signed book plate as well as a branded bookmark. thank you so much for joining us for this interview. We've got loads more to come, so I'll see you next time.